Good afternoon. We are coming on the air with breaking news. Former President Donald Trump has made his choice. Mr. Trump just posted on his social media platform, Truth Social, that Ohio Senator JD Vance will be his running mate and Republican nominee for vice president ahead of this year's general election. So this year's Republican ticket will be Trump Vance. Senator Vance has been in the Senate for less than 2 years, but has aligned himself consistently with Mr. Trump during that time. The news comes just before they're both set to be formally nominated today on the first day of the Republican National Convention. It also comes less than 48 hours after the assassination attempt on Mr. Trump at his rally over the weekend, as well as just hours after the documents case was dismissed by the judge in Florida. Our senior Washington correspondent, Hallie Jackson, joins me live now with this breaking news. Hallie, you and I have been working our sources throughout the day. Not a huge surprise because we learned that North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum was out. We learned that Senator Marco Rubio was out. How do you think the party faithful will respond to this pick?
JD Vance, the freshman first-term senator from Ohio, is widely seen, as you well know, Kristen, as the next generation of the MAGA movement, if you will. He is somebody who has had the strong and outspoken support of not just, clearly, former President Trump, but his son, Donald Trump Jr., who's been a big advocate for JD Vance all along. And in conversations with sources before this moment, one of the things that I've heard is that Senator Vance could be helpful to the former president in some of those rural exurban areas of some of these critical Rust Belt states, in Michigan, in Wisconsin, in Pennsylvania. Listen, those are not places where former President Trump would have likely been at risk of not doing well, but perhaps on the turnout push, there is some indication that that is where they like JD Vance. They like Senator Vance. You have the former president in this Truth Social today saying that after lengthy deliberation and thought and considering the tremendous talents of many others, he has decided, of course, that the person, as he says, best suited to assume the position is, in fact, Senator Vance. You can see that post here. And this comes at a moment, Kristen, where we are just minutes away from this ticket becoming, let's call it official, no longer presumptive, with former President Trump any minute now set to go, as we call it, over the top and get enough delegates to lock up the nomination. I can tell you, based on my reporting, and I know you've been working your sources too, the other two contenders on the short list, as NBC News had reported, was Florida Senator Marco Rubio and North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum. I am told by a source that, as it relates to Senator Rubio, there was a concern about that residency requirement, about both men being in the same place. That is partly why they felt like they couldn't get to a good resolution on that. He's not the pick, and I know you've been talking to your Burgum sources too.
I have been, and look, Burgum was widely seen, Hallie, as someone who would have been safe. He would have never overshadowed Donald Trump. And the pick of JD Vance is so fascinating. This is The Apprentice pick in some ways.
The drama, the intrigue on this pick.
And he's really seen as the future of the MAGA movement. Now, there are some who are worried. Will this resonate with moderates, with independents, with those Nikki Haley voters who Donald Trump needs to win over if he wants to win this election, Hallie?
It's a great point, and I think that part of the calculus here, too, with Senator Vance has been the way, listen, we know Donald Trump. We know what the former president likes. He likes people who speak out strongly and forcefully on his behalf. And boy, Senator Vance has certainly made the rounds doing that over the course of the former president's campaign here. Wasn't always that way, as I know we'll get into, but there is obviously a sense of installing somebody here, I think clearly based on this pick and reading through this long Truth Social again that lays out, of course, JD Vance's resume here, this online post, a sense that he will be somebody who is loyal to former President Trump. All of it, of course, we have to note, as this convention, I mean, this is literally just the beginning of this significant moment for the Republican Party, and it's taken on a different tone, of course, since that assassination attempt against former President Trump less than 48 hours ago. He is now here in Milwaukee at this critical moment for the party, the first time that we have seen a vice presidential pick rolled out this century, in a couple of decades, at a convention and not before.
The history is just fascinating. Hallie, let's bring in our Capitol Hill correspondent, Ryan Nobles. Ryan, of course, this pick comes against the backdrop just days after that assassination attempt against former President Trump. So there is a bit of a somber feeling as well that is kicking off this convention. We should say, you hear the noise behind me. They are in the process of officially nominating Donald Trump to be their party's nominee, and we are just moments away from getting to Ohio, the home state of JD Vance. What are you hearing there, Ryan?
Well, Kristen, I think that for many of us on Capitol Hill, JD Vance was thought to be the front runner in this contest from almost the very beginning. He was someone thought of to be very loyal to Donald Trump, especially when he made the decision to run for elective office. Of course, JD Vance's story is a pretty remarkable American story, someone that was born into poverty, spending time in both Kentucky and Ohio. He, of course, was the author of that blockbuster book, Hillbilly Elegy, which came out right around the time Donald Trump was elected president back in 2016. And it became, in many ways, a thesis of the average American in middle America who resonated and connected with Donald Trump. And in many ways, JD Vance was called upon to try and decode the explanations behind which someone like Donald Trump could resonate with that community, because he was someone who understood the people of those communities. Now, it's important to point out that initially JD Vance was not a very strong supporter of Donald Trump. He was very critical of him throughout the 2016 campaign. But as time went on, after Donald Trump won that election, and when Vance himself began to explore the idea of political office, he became more and more aligned with the MAGA movement, became very close with Donald Trump Jr. and members of the Trump family. And then when he decided to run for the seat that was being left open by Rob Portman in Ohio, that's when he really fully embraced the MAGA movement and really ran as a MAGA candidate and successfully collected Donald Trump's nomination in that primary process, which played a big role in securing that primary and then ultimately seeing him elected to the United States Senate. He's someone without a lot of governing experience, right? He was just elected to the Senate back in 2022, so he hasn't even served a full 2 years. He does not have a great deal of seniority as a result of that. In fact, he's the second youngest member of the United States Senate. So this is an interesting pick, a compelling one for President Trump.
It certainly is, Ryan, and we will track the reaction closely. I want to dip into what we are watching on the floor now. They are just going to the home state of JD Vance, Ohio. Let's listen into some of this as they officially nominate Donald Trump to be the party's nominee.
I stand here today with my friend Bernie Moreno, who's going to retire forever, politician Sherrod Brown, and deliver a win to the United States Senate. We proudly cast our 79 votes for President Donald J. Trump
and JD Vance.
Pursuant to the announcement of the delegation and the rules and procedures of this convention, Iowa, 79 votes, President Trump.
In there, we were just listening to the Ohio delegation officially nominate Donald Trump to be their party's nominee. Of course, you heard them also, Hallie, gleefully shout out the name JD Vance. You could hear the pride. Obviously, this is a moment that's going to be filled with pride for the Ohio delegation.
What is so interesting, the floor is filled, obviously, with these delegates doing this roll call, and word has obviously gotten out, Kristen.
Yes.
I mean, everybody's got the phones, they've got the Truth Social. We are up here elevated from the floor, but you can hear that from the Ohio delegation there. What's also interesting is we are also hearing now from some of the would-have-been VP picks, if you will, including Senator Marco Rubio, who was tweeting just moments ago, posting online, #TrumpVance2024. This is the ticket. This is officially the Republican ticket. Of course, the question now, how do you see, and we're talking pure politics here, how do you see the Biden-Harris ticket now begin to position itself against the Trump-Vance ticket? Because there will be, presumably, court press now. We know that, as you well know, Kristen, President Biden and his campaign paused a lot of the campaigning, the ads, et cetera, after that attempted assassination. That will, of course, pick back up in the days and hours to come.
And, of course, questions swirling about President Biden's candidacy stalled to some extent in the wake of the assassination attempt against former President Donald Trump. Let's go out to the action on the floor with NBC's Vaughn Hilliard, who joins us. Vaughn, tell us what it's like there. Set the scene.
Hey there, guys. We're here with Senator Tuberville, who you talked to the former president just this morning ahead of his selection. What did he tell you in that phone conversation?
Well, first of all, it was very early, about 7 o'clock. I don't remember all of it, but he doesn't sleep very much. He works all the time. But, you know, we talked, first of all, about what happened this weekend. He feels very fortunate. Obviously, he was in good spirits. We have talked several times over the last year about the VP candidate, and I've always thrown my 2 cents worth in. Sometimes he listens, sometimes he doesn't. He had some great choices. JD Vance will be an excellent pick. There was a couple more of my friends in the Senate that could have been good, candidates. But I think JD's learned a lot. He's young. He's energetic. I think people will really understand his voice in terms of his communication. The guy's awesome in terms of his intelligence. He knows everything about politics in a short period of time. I'm talking about it in terms of policy. So
you said that former President Trump was making his decision still this morning when you were on the phone with him.
Yeah, he was still. I don't know if somebody was leading at that time, but he was asking me questions about him and a couple other people. But again, he made the decision. Nobody else made it for him, and he did it the right way. You got to do it the right way. You got to look at all the options. JD will be awesome.
We just asked Don Jr., the son of Donald Trump, when he walked by here, about the pick. Of course, those two are very allied. They have struck up a close relationship. For folks across the country who do not know JD Vance, in a nutshell, how would you describe him in terms of how he will be as an ally to Donald Trump versus even the Mike Pence when he was vice president?
Well, the first thing about JD, he's not a politician, okay? He is a lawyer, but he's a guy that came in and he spoke his opinion from day one in all of our caucus meetings.
Vaughn, I'm so sorry to interrupt your conversation.
He's a guy that.
Vaughn, I have to interrupt your conversation. We're going to go to Florida now. Donald Trump about to go over the top. Let's watch.
Madam Secretary and everybody in this great city. On behalf of our entire family and on behalf of the 125 delegates in the unbelievable state of Florida, we hereby nominate every single one of them for the greatest president that's ever lived, and that's Donald J. Trump. Hereby declaring him the Republican nominee for President of the United States of America.
Pursuant to the announcement of the delegation and the rules and procedures of this convention, Florida, 125 votes, President Trump.
Trump's children, Eric Trump, Laura Trump, his wife, of course, an RNC official, Don Jr., Tiffany Trump, making it official. The Republican Party just moments ago making it official right behind me, and Hallie Jackson here formally nominating former President Donald Trump for president for the third time. Mr. Trump's home state of Florida putting him over the top, giving him the majority of delegates needed to secure the Republican nomination to become the next president of the United States. All of this just moments after we learned Senator JD Vance will be his vice presidential running mate. And again, I'm here with Hallie Jackson. 2,268 delegates needed, Hallie. It's official now.
It is official, Kristen. We are in this campaign for real. No longer do we refer to former President Trump as the presumptive Republican nominee. This is his race, and what is so clear sitting in this convention hall, Kristen, this is his party. You are seeing that top to bottom here, unlike the last couple of times. Remember, this is his third time now officially being nominated for this position, obviously in 2016 and again in 2020. And his grip on the party has hardened in a significant way over the course of the last 8 years or so. It is, let's acknowledge it, somewhat incongruous, of course. This is a a party in many ways, conventions usually are, to be listening to celebrate good times after what happened just 2 days ago, and that attempted assassination against the former president, as he has described how surreal it was now in a pair of new interviews to have that bullet whizzing past his head, striking his ear, obviously, saying he's supposed to be dead right now, and instead here he is getting ready to accept the nomination officially, Kristen.
Yeah, and Hallie, I spoke to someone who'd spoken to the former president who described him as contemplative, feeling like he has a new lease on life. And there was a big question about what the tone would feel like here at the Republican National Convention. Well, right now, the tone, as Hallie just said, is one of celebration. Let's bring in Jacob Soboroff inside the convention center right here in Milwaukee. And Jacob, I understand you just spoke with the Trump family. What'd they tell you?
I did. They feel very grateful, Kristen, for obviously the fact that their father survived. It was a miraculous survival. And in the words of Don and Eric both, this is a very special day for their family. They're now moving out of the Florida delegation where they've just been able to put him over the top. Let's see if we can walk a little bit with them as they go. But obviously from this point in the Florida delegation, here's Don right now. Let me see if I can get Don.
Keep fighting for this country. That was everything for me. I just literally told him, I go, you're the biggest fan.
I'm going to let Kimberly out here. Kimberly, how do you feel about JD Vance being the vice presidential nominee?
I really like him personally. I think he's a good man. He's a great father, a great husband, a great American who served the country. He's intelligent, articulate, he's thoughtful, contemplative, and we want someone like that, a steady measure that will really enhance and really be part of the ticket to support President Trump in this mission to take back the country and the America First movement.
What can you tell us about the former president's decision, why he chose JD Vance, when he made up his mind?
Well, he had a tremendous amount of amazing candidates to choose from, and he was really thoughtful about the whole process, evaluating everything, what would be in the best interest of the country, and someone that he thinks would be best to serve the country if he were not able to as commander-in-chief. And I think that's an important decision, especially in light of the horrific violent events that occurred, the coward trying to take the life and assassinate the 45th president of the United States. So that was a lesson in American political history, that the choice of vice president matters. And so now we feel really happy and confident about this, that we are in very good shape as a country to move forward if the American people are willing to re-elect President Trump and now potential vice presidential nominee.
Thank you very much. We're very glad that the former president's doing well. Appreciate it. Thank you. Chris, I'm going to send it back to you. I'm going to see if we can get Don when he frees up in just a moment.
All right, Jacob, we'll come back to you if you get that interview. Really fascinating to hear from Kimberly Guilfoyle there. Again, the girlfriend of Don Jr., who is very supportive of this pick of JD Vance to be Donald Trump's running mate. It is worth noting, Hallie, as we sit here, there were some boos that erupted here on the convention floor. It was when Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell walked out onto the floor. And it really underscores the fact that the Republican Party is unified, and yet there are still divisions within it. McConnell has been critical of former President Trump, particularly in the wake of January 6th. He only recently endorsed him, something that infuriated the Trump team. What did you make of that moment and where we are right now?
It tells you a lot about the arc of the Republican Party, Kristen, and exactly what you're laying out here and what you're describing. Remember, you're talking about the top Senate Republican. In any other universe, right, this would be somebody who is right up there with the former president, with his cabinet members as far as stature and respect inside the party. And while, of course, there are those inside the establishment, quote unquote, who continue to support Mitch McConnell, he does not have the grip on the conference in the Senate side that he once had. That is just, I think, in plain reality over the course of the last 5-6 years or so. A striking moment to hear those boos on the floor. You and I both turned around because we thought, wait a second, what's going on down there? As there is so much action. We know the Trump kids are down there. Obviously, Laura Trump, his daughter-in-law, who heads the Republican National Committee, as well as you saw Eric Trump, Don Jr., and then Kimberly, as we just saw with Jacob.
It was notable. Kimberly Guilfoyle said something to Jacob Soboroff, Hallie, that stood out to me. She really stressed the importance of the vice presidential pick. And it comes, of course, as Republicans have been so focused on Vice President Kamala Harris in the wake of these swirling questions about whether President Biden would ever pass the torch after that debate performance that he had several weeks ago. It was a reminder that the vice presidential nominee will be in focus in this election cycle.
And I would not be surprised to see JD Vance take on the role of the primary Kamala Harris attacker, if you will. Think about that moment when the two of them potentially, we don't know that this has been nailed down yet, but take a debate stage and go head to head. And the contrast between these two candidates, both seen inside their own parties in different ways as the next generation of leadership, with two candidates who obviously are in their late 70s and early 80s. And so it is a contrast in every way at this moment.
All right, we're going to go back to the action and Jacob Soboroff with Don Jr. Jacob?
We just got boxed out of the scrum. I'm going to go around one more time, guys. I'm going to send it back to you until we can get in there.
If anybody can get him, it's Jacob.
Jacob can get him. Keep trying. Well, Jacob, we're going to stay with you actually on the floor. Narrate, if you would, for us what you're seeing,
right
what you're hearing
guys.
down
So
there,
as you can see, it's very busy. He's about to come through right here. Let's see. Come on through. I'm about to get my head pinched, guys. Here we go. Sorry, guys.
On the election, just with his background and with that story, and so I couldn't be happier.
You're now live on CBS. Explain to those watching why you think JD Vance is the best man to run with your phone.
Listen, I think he's lived the epitome of the American dream story.
All right, Jacob, we'll come back to you when you get a little closer to Don Jr.
Is that classic convention floor or what?
That's the incredible thing about being on the convention floor. Democracy in action, right, Hallie? One of the things I'm struck by as we talk about this pick of J.D. Vance is the issue of abortion. We have seen J.D. Vance shift his views in a range of different areas, one of them in the very way he talks about Donald Trump, again, going from a self-described never-Trumper to one of Trump's fiercest critics, but also on this issue of abortion. He was asked recently about the Texas ban on abortion that doesn't include exceptions, and he sort of downplayed that. That was something that the Trump team was looking at. He has moderated himself on Meet the Press 2 weeks ago. In fact, he echoed Donald Trump saying, I would support the abortion pill continuing to be accessible to all Americans, mifepristone. What do you make of the issue of abortion and how it may play out in this election cycle?
It'll be front and center in the minds and in the eyes of Democrats who want to press that case. They want to press that issue, Kristen. And J.D. Vance will be somebody, I think, and we are waiting, of course, on any reaction from the Biden-Harris campaign to this news on the issue of reproductive rights. And the reason for that is because Democrats have seen this as a mobilizing issue. They believe that there will be increased turnout if they can get their supporters to get out there to vote come November. We saw that. They saw that after the overturning of Roe versus Wade back in the midterms. And so there is a sense, can that be replicated? That is why I think you will see that be front and center, especially, again, with Vice President Kamala Harris. She has been in so many ways the face of the administration's push on that.
It's so interesting. She has been tasked with dealing with the issue of migration, various other issues, but it's that issue, Hallie, reproductive rights, abortion, where she's really been front and center. Well, Mr. Trump's running mate could have a huge impact on the campaign trail and who ultimately wins the general election. Our Gabe Gutierrez has a closer look at who Senator Vance is and what he brings to the table.
He is the junior senator from Ohio with only 2 years in government, but J.D. Vance is one of former President Trump's biggest defenders.
I want to help Donald Trump get elected because it's really important that he become the next president.
In the Senate,
how can we defend Ukraine's borders when we're not even defending our own American border?
And on the campaign trail.
The question is, are we going to send America First fighters to Washington, D.C.?
He's one of the leading voices of Trump's MAGA America First movement, not holding back and pushing the former president's agenda.
Republicans, we need to govern like we won the majority the American people gave us, not like a bunch of cowards.
But that hasn't always been the case. This was Vance in 2016.
I'm a never Trump guy. I never liked him.
He was deeply critical of Trump then, but here's Vance just 6 years later.
The president is right. I wasn't always nice, but the simple fact is he's the best president of my lifetime, and he revealed the corruption in this country like nobody else.
running for Senate in 2022 in Ohio as an extremely pro-Trump candidate.
I was wrong about Donald Trump. I didn't think he was going to be a good president, Brett. He was a great president.
Vance shot to fame as the author of Hillbilly Elegy, a memoir about his upbringing in a poor, hard-hit part of Ohio. He then enlisted in the Marines, went to Yale Law School, into venture capital, and then to the Senate, his first role in government. On the major issues, Vance has said he would support a national ban on abortion after 15 weeks, but is for exceptions, including for rape and the life of the mother. On immigration, Vance has called for finishing Trump's southern border wall. And on the issue of the 2020 presidential election, then Senate candidate Vance suggested he would have supported fraudulent slates of pro-Trump electors.
If I had been vice president, I would have told the states like Pennsylvania, Georgia, and so many others that we needed to have multiple slates of electors, and I think the U.S. Congress should have fought over it from there. That is
now the father of two, just 39 years old, after not even a full 2 years in government, is set to step onto the biggest political stage in the world.
And our thanks to Gabe Gutierrez for that report. Again, the headline here from Milwaukee, the Republican Party has made it official. Donald Trump is officially the party's nominee for president. It comes as Mr. Trump has announced that Ohio Senator JD Vance, 39 years old, will be his running mate. We will continue to bring you updates as we get them. But for now, that concludes this NBC News special report. We'll have much more ahead on our streaming network, NBC News Now, online at NBCNews.com, and a full wrap-up tonight on NBC Nightly News. Plus, do not miss Lester Holt's exclusive interview with President Biden, which will air in full at 9 p.m. Eastern. And our coverage of the first night of the Republican National Convention kicks off at 9:30 Eastern. Our thanks to everyone, Hallie Jackson, Jacob Soboroff, everyone on the floor, as well as Ryan Nobles. I am Kristen Welker. Thank you for watching.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.